They laughed when she said it. My own daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "You won't last a week without us." Not a joke, not a warning, a verdict. They thought my silence meant weakness. They had no idea it was a calm before I took everything they built, and watched it crumble. I gave them my trust before I gave them my time. When my husband passed, I didn't just lose a partner, I lost my shield. My son stepped in, or at least I thought he did. Slowly, without me noticing, the house I paid for, the business I helped grow, and the family I held together stopped feeling like mine. They made decisions without me, spoke over me, counted my days like I was already gone. Then came the sentence that changed everything. You wouldn't survive a week without us. That's when I realized they didn't see me as family anymore. They saw me as a liability. And that's when I decided to remind them who laid the first brick of their empire. I didn't build what they proudly called the asterisk empire in boardrooms or with flashy titles. I built it in the quiet corners of life, where no one claps and no one keeps score. Long before my son ever signed his first deal, before his name appeared on letterheads or business cards, there was me, sitting at the kitchen table late into the night, bills spread out, calculator clicking, working out how to stretch $1 into $3. I was the one who sold my jewelry when cash flow ran dry, who dipped into savings meant for emergencies that never seemed to end. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because that's what you do when family is everything. When my husband was still alive, we dreamed together, not of empires, but of stability, a roof that couldn't be taken away, a business that could feed our children even when times were tough. When he passed, that dream didn't die. It landed squarely on my shoulders. Grief doesn't pause responsibility. I learned that quickly. I showed up every day with a tight chest and a brave face, because my son was watching, and I knew if I broke, he would too. I was the one who introduced him to our first serious client, a man who trusted me, not some young bloke with big ideas. I vouched for my son with my reputation, the only currency I had. I sat in meetings where I wasn't officially invited, pouring tea, listening carefully, memorizing details no one thought mattered. Later, those details saved deals. I never asked for credit. Watching my son succeed felt like success enough. Then he married. At first, I was relieved. I thought he'd found someone strong, someone who'd stand beside him the way I once stood beside his father. I welcomed her into my home, into my routines, into the heart of everything I had built. I handed over access, bank details, documents, contacts, because that's what trust looks like when you believe family means loyalty. Slowly, almost invisibly, the ground shifted beneath my feet. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Decisions were made without asking my opinion, even on matters I'd handled for years. When I did speak up, I was met with polite smiles that carried a sharp edge. Times have changed, they'd say. This is how business works now. As if experience suddenly expired with age. What hurt most wasn't being pushed aside. It was being rewritten. Stories changed. Sacrifices were minimized. I became helpful in the early days, like a temporary assistant rather than the backbone. My name disappeared from conversations, from acknowledgments, from memory. They spoke about the business as if it had appeared fully formed the moment they took control, as if it hadn't been nursed through fragile beginnings by a woman who skipped meals so invoices could be paid. I told myself it was just pride talking, that this is what parents do. Step back, let the next generation shine. But deep down, something felt wrong. Respect wasn't fading naturally. It was being stripped deliberately. My daughter-in-law began speaking for my son, correcting him when he mentioned my involvement, laughing it off like it was some cute exaggeration. Each time, my chest tightened, but I stayed quiet. Silence had kept the peace before. I believed it would again. What they never understood was that my quiet wasn't ignorance. It was observation. I noticed how often they leaned on foundations they hadn't built. I remembered which assets were placed in whose name and why. I remembered promises made during hard years, promises they assumed I'd forgotten because I didn't remind them every day. They mistook my restraint for weakness, my kindness for dependence. The empire they bragged about stood on years of unseen labor, emotional and financial. It stood on my endurance, my reputation, my willingness to give without counting the cost. And while they enjoyed the view from the top, they forgot who poured the concrete at the bottom. That was their first mistake. They chose a week because a week sounds short enough to break someone. 7 days feels manageable when you're the one holding the power. When my daughter-in-law said it, there was a confidence in her voice that cut deeper than the words themselves. Asterisk, you wouldn't last a week without us. Asterisk, she said it like a fact already proven, like my future had been calculated and dismissed in the same breath. My son didn't stop her. He didn't defend me. He just looked away. And in that moment, something inside me cracked quietly. That week didn't start with drama. It started with absence. The phone that once rang with updates, questions, and requests went silent. Messages I sent were read but not answered. Meals were cooked without asking if I'd be joining. Plans were made as if I no longer existed under the same roof. It's strange how isolation can be louder than shouting. Every empty chair, every closed door, echoed with the same message. Asterisk, you are no longer needed. Asterisk. Then came the practical cuts. Access to shared accounts was suddenly being reorganized. Bills I'd always managed were handled already. When I asked simple questions, I was told not to worry, that it was all taken care of. But being told not to worry is often the first sign you should. I felt like a guest in a life I had built, watching others rearrange furniture without asking where things belonged. The first night of that so-called week, I barely slept. Not because I was scared of being alone, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying moments I brushed aside for years. Every small dismissal. Every we'll talk about it later that never came. I realized then how slowly I'd been edged out, how carefully my dependence had been assumed. They thought I relied on them emotionally, financially, practically. They thought removing themselves would leave me helpless. By the second day, the sadness gave way to clarity. I made tea and sat at the same kitchen table where I once balanced accounts and solved problems no one else wanted to face. Only this time, I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for myself. I opened old files, some digital, some paper, the kind people forget still matter. I read contracts I hadn't looked at in years, agreements signed during desperate times when my support wasn't optional. It was essential. I remembered why certain decisions were made the way they were, why assets were placed under specific names, why signatures mattered. They had rushed ahead, confident that control meant ownership. But control without understanding is fragile. And I had always understood more than I let on. Midweek, they expected the call, the apology, the emotional collapse. I could almost feel them waiting for it, convinced that silence from me meant I was falling apart. Instead, my silence was busy. I contacted an old accountant who still remembered the early chaos, who still respected the sacrifices made back then. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I just asked questions. Careful ones. The kind that opened doors you didn't even know were still unlocked. Emotionally, that week was brutal in a way I never anticipated. It's one thing to be underestimated by strangers. It's another to be dismissed by the people you raised, the people you protected with your own life. I cried, yes, but not out of fear. I cried for the years I spent shrinking myself so others could feel tall. For every time I chose peace over being seen. For every moment I convinced myself that love meant letting go of recognition. By the 5th day, something solid formed inside me. Resolve. Not anger, not revenge. Resolve. I realized I didn't want them to suffer. I wanted the truth to stand. I wanted my existence, my contribution, my authority to be undeniable. If that meant shaking the structure they'd built on my back, then so be it. Structures that deny their foundations deserve to crack. When the week ended, they expected a broken woman. What they didn't see was someone who had survived worse than silence. Someone who had built strength in years of being overlooked. The week they chose to test me became the week I stopped waiting for permission to exist in my own story. And without them even realizing it yet, that week had already changed everything. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy anything. That's the story people like to tell when they see consequences without context. What I did wake up with, though, was certainty. The kind that settles in your bones once confusion finally leaves. I knew that if I spoke too loudly, showed too much emotion, or revealed even a fraction of what I was planning, they would rush to protect themselves. They were good at that, at closing ranks, shifting blame, rewriting narratives. So I became quieter than ever. From the outside, it must have looked like acceptance. I cooked my meals, took my walks, nodded when spoken to. I let them believe the week had worn me down. That illusion was my greatest protection. While they mistook my calm for defeat, I was mapping every corner of what they thought they owned. I started with the past, because that's where the truth usually hides. Old emails, archived messages, handwritten notes tucked away in folders no one had touched in years. I found reminders of conversations held during crises, moments when the business would have collapsed if I hadn't stepped in. There were promises written casually but signed formally, clauses added in a hurry, assets registered temporarily that never moved again. They had built upward without checking whether the ground beneath them had shifted. Each discovery didn't bring satisfaction. It brought grief. Because with every document I uncovered, I was reminded that trust had once existed. These weren't tricks or traps I'd laid. They were safeguards put in place during vulnerable moments, meant to protect the family, not to be weaponized later. The fact that I now had to rely on them felt like a betrayal in itself. I moved carefully, one phone call at a time. I spoke to people who remembered me not as someone's mother, but as someone who got things done. An old solicitor who had drafted agreements when my husband was still alive. A business partner who'd stepped away years earlier but still respected the way I handled conflict. Directly, quietly, without drama. I didn't ask them to fight for me. I asked them to explain my options. Knowledge is power, but understanding is what sharpens it. What surprised me most was how fragile everything suddenly seemed. The empire my son and daughter-in-law spoke about with such pride relied heavily on assumptions, that I wouldn't challenge them, that I wouldn't understand the complexity, that I wouldn't dare disrupt the image they created. They believed legality and legitimacy were the same thing. They are not. One can exist without the other, but only briefly. Emotionally, this was the hardest phase. Planning requires distance, and distance hurts when it's from people you once loved deeply. I had moments where I nearly stopped, where I thought, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe peace is better than justice. But then I'd remember the look on her face when she said I wouldn't last a week. The certainty, the dismissal, and I'd realize that if I stayed silent now, I would be agreeing with her assessment of my worth. So I proceeded, not with fire, but with precision. Letters were drafted, not sent. Numbers were reviewed, not shade. I learned where leverage existed and where it didn't. I learned which parts of the business could survive scrutiny, and which relied entirely on my absence. The more I understood, the clearer it became, I wasn't tearing anything down. I was simply stepping back into a space I'd never truly left. There's a strange calm that comes when you stop seeking approval. I felt it one afternoon as I sat alone, papers spread around me, sunlight falling across ink that once represented hope. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Focused on restoring balance, on making sure my voice carried weight again, not through shouting, but through action. They continued their lives, unaware. Meetings were held. Plans were made. My name still didn't come up, except perhaps as an inconvenience. That ignorance gave me time. Time to prepare for the moment when truth would arrive quietly, without spectacle, and settle heavily on their shoulders. By the time everything was ready, I understood something essential. The fire I was accused of lighting was never about destruction. It was about illumination, about forcing everyone to see what had always been there. And once the lights came on, there would be no way to pretend the foundation wasn't mine. They thought empires fall with explosions. Sometimes they fall with a signature. The collapse didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It came in the form of emails marked *urgent*, meetings suddenly postponed, and phone calls that went unanswered. I noticed the change before they did. The house felt heavier, like the walls themselves sensed a shift. My son started pacing more, checking his phone with a tight jaw. My daughter-in-law's confidence, once effortless, became brittle. She spoke faster, laughed louder, as if noise could hold things together.